She'd been sitting in that waiting room since 5 in the morning. St. Agnes Hospital in Chicago ran a walk-in prenatal clinic every Tuesday for women whose insurance hadn't come through yet, and there were only so many slots. Kira Whitmore was 27, 4 months along, still waiting on a Medicaid decision, and wearing a coat that had seen better years. When her turn finally came, she slid her paperwork across the counter and waited. The woman behind the glass glanced down once, at the frayed cuffs, at the sneaker held together with a strip of duct tape. Then she pushed the papers back without reading a single line. "The free slots are gone for today. Have a seat. Someone will come find you." Kira didn't argue. She never did anymore. She just stepped back and stood by the pillar, one hand resting low on her stomach, and watched a woman in a wool coat walk in 3 minutes behind her and walk straight out with a number in her hand. That was an ordinary Tuesday morning in that lobby, and nothing about it seemed unusual, not to anyone standing there. Then the front doors opened, and every sound in that room died at once. 2 men held the doors. A third walked through dark coat, no hurry, carrying the kind of quiet that makes a room go quiet with him. Nobody said his name. Nobody had to. He took 4 steps into the lobby and stopped, because he'd seen the woman standing alone by the pillar. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at the woman behind the glass. He looked down for a second, then back up, and asked, so softly that people leaned in to hear it, "How long has my wife been standing here?" The receptionist didn't understand yet, but the security guard by the door understood, and he took a step backward. And Kira, who had spent 4 months making absolutely certain this man would never find her, felt the floor go out from under her. If you want to know what happens next, hit that like button and subscribe. It really does help this channel reach more people. And if you know someone who's ever been made to feel invisible, share this with them. Now let's get back to the story. Kira edged half a step closer, near enough to touch the sleeve of his coat, and gave it a gentle tug. The kind of tug made by someone trying to stop something that had already slipped beyond her control. She spoke very softly, just loud enough for the 2 of them to hear. "I'm not your wife." Romano didn't pull his arm away. He didn't turn to look at her right away either, but kept his eyes on the glass of the reception counter for another beat, as though he were reading something written there that only he could see. Then he looked down at her, and his voice remained as quiet as before. "Today, you have to be." She meant to say more, but before she could open her mouth, the sound of shoes came running across the stone floor, and then a man of about 56 burst out from the hallway behind them, still holding a paper cup of coffee in one hand, his tie crooked to one side. He made it 3 steps before slowing down, straightening his tie, and continuing forward with the manner of a man trying to make it look as though he had merely happened to be passing by. He introduced himself as Thomas Kessler, the hospital's chief executive officer, and he addressed Romano in the kind of voice people used only when they already knew they were standing on the wrong side of a conversation. "If there's been any oversight, I'd very much like to resolve it right here, sir." Romano didn't shake his hand. He didn't answer that statement either. He simply said, "Show me this morning's registration log." Kessler blinked. "The registration log, sir?" "The walk-in clinic queue log," Romano said, still in exactly the same tone. "From 5 o'clock this morning until now. Every name, every check-in time, every number ticket that was issued." There was a silence that lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds Kira realized something that made her stomach tighten. No one in this lobby had asked who he was. Not one person. The security guard by the door had already backed away and still hadn't dared step forward again. The woman behind the glass was searching for something beneath the counter, with 2 hands that no longer seemed capable of working together. And Kessler had turned toward the desk and called the woman's name twice, the second time louder than the first, without even realizing that the entire lobby could hear him. The book was brought out. Romano didn't take it. He simply stood there while Kessler opened it himself, ran his finger down the column of times, then stopped at one line and fell silent. He read the line again. Beside it were 3 other entries made later, with later check-in times, and all 3 had ticket numbers. Kira's did not. Kessler closed the book more slowly than necessary. "This is a procedural error," he said. "We'll review the entire process." Romano gave one very small nod, and that nod made Kessler snap toward the reception desk and begin issuing orders. In less than a minute, the ground floor of St. Agnes Hospital began moving in a way Kira had never seen during the 4 months she had been coming there. Someone called the maternity department. Someone carrying a radio headed toward the elevators. A charge nurse appeared from the hallway on the left, listened to 2 sentences, then walked directly to Kira and asked her name, how far along she was, whether she had abdominal pain, whether she was bleeding, her voice quick and professional, as though Kira had just been rushed in from an ambulance instead of standing beside that column since 5 in the morning. Kira answered each question, and with every word she heard, her own voice growing smaller. She didn't feel triumphant. Heat burned along both sides of her ears. An entire hospital lobby was looking at her, and what they saw wasn't a 27-year-old pregnant woman who had come for prenatal care. They saw someone who had just been claimed by another person. She had been sitting here since 5 o'clock in the morning, trying to take care of herself. And in the end, the thing that had opened the door wasn't anything she had done. They led her toward the elevators. After a few steps, Kira looked back for him and saw Romano still standing exactly where he had been, one hand in his coat pocket, not watching her leave, saying something brief to Kessler. The hospital director kept nodding, and it was at that exact moment, as she turned her head, that her gaze passed over a man standing partly hidden beside the second column near the exit, about 13 feet from where she had been standing earlier. He hadn't stepped back like the security guard. He wasn't restless like the people sitting in the waiting area. He wasn't watching Romano or Kessler. He was watching her, and when he saw her looking back, he lowered his eyes with effortless ease, pulled a phone from his coat pocket, turned halfway toward the wall, and began typing. The elevator doors opened. Kira stepped inside. She thought he was simply another visitor calling his wife to tell her what had just happened at the hospital, and she would forget the detail before the day was over. It would be more than 4 months later, in a completely different place, before she saw that face for the second time. The ultrasound room on the 7th floor was small and cool, and they didn't make her wait even a single minute. Dr. Claire Bishop, 47 years old, came in carrying a thin file, skimmed through it, then did the one thing no one downstairs had done that morning. She pulled over a chair, sat down at Kira's eye level, and asked whether she had eaten breakfast. Kira said she hadn't. Dr. Bishop nodded, wrote down a line, then asked about her last menstrual period, about the nausea, about whether she was taking vitamins. Kira answered honestly, saying she had bought a bottle but had run out 3 weeks ago. The doctor made no comment. She simply wrote another line and told Kira to lie back on the table. At that exact moment, the door opened and Romano walked in. He didn't ask anyone for permission. He went straight to the far end of the room, where a plastic chair stood against the wall, and stopped there with one hand resting on the back of it. Dr. Bishop glanced at him for exactly 1 second before returning to her work, and Kira understood that no one on the 7th floor intended to ask who he was either. Cold gel. The sound of the machine starting. Dr. Bishop moved the probe in a slow circle, stopped, shifted it a little farther, then turned the screen toward Kira. 16 weeks, she said, strong heartbeat. Measurements are right on track for gestational age. Then she turned on the speaker. The room filled with a sound that was fast, steady, and full. The rhythm Kira had been hearing in her mind for months as something abstract, and now it existed outside her, real, louder than the hum of the air conditioner. She looked at the screen. Then she looked toward the far end of the room. Romano hadn't moved. He didn't take a single step closer, didn't say a word, didn't ask the doctor anything. But the hand resting on the back of the chair had tightened, his knuckles changing color, and he remained that way, his eyes fixed on the gray and white image moving across the screen for nearly 3 full minutes, while Dr. Bishop measured the circumference of the baby's head, measured the femur, and typed on the keyboard. Kira turned her face away. She didn't want to look anymore, because if she kept looking, she would have to think about that night, the night she had spent 4 months teaching herself not to think about. The Blue Hour was on the ground floor of an old building, and she worked the night shift there 3 evenings a week. That man came in 3 nights in a row, always sitting on the last stool at the bar, always ordering water, never finishing it. The first night, he said nothing except thank you. The second night, he asked what time the place closed. On the third night, a regular customer got drunk enough to grab her wrist as she passed. And before she could pull free, the man at the end of the bar spoke a single sentence, not loudly, without even standing up. Let go of her hand and go home. The other man released her immediately. He paid his bill, apologized twice, then left, and he never came back to that bar again. Kira stood wiping the counter for a long time before she finally asked him, "What do you do for a living?" he said. "I look after a few things for my family." She didn't ask anything else. When her shift ended, she stayed, and they talked until 3 o'clock in the morning. She told him about her mother, Evelyn, who had spent 11 days in a hospital, and how Kira had been the one to sign the financial responsibility form because there had been no one else left to sign it. She told him she had once studied nursing and dropped out halfway through her second year. He asked why. She said money, and he didn't ask another question, something no one else had ever managed to do with her. She remembered thinking, this man doesn't need to know who I am in order to listen to me speak. At 5 o'clock in the morning, she woke first, walked to the window, and pulled the curtain open just enough to look down at the street. 2 black cars were parked about 65 feet from the main entrance, their lights off, their engines still running. 4 men stood outside the vehicles, not speaking to one another, not smoking, simply standing there. She let the curtain fall. She dressed in the dark, picked up her bag, and left through the emergency stairwell at the end of the hall. She left no name, no phone number, not a single written line. Dr. Bishop's voice pulled her back. She was asking whether Kira wanted a printed picture. Kira said yes. The printer whirred and fed out a sheet of thermal paper, and the doctor handed it to her. Then she removed her gloves, finished writing in the chart, and said in an ordinary voice that Kira's Medicaid application was still pending, but beginning today, she would be scheduled for regular appointments in this department every 2 weeks, and someone would call to remind her. Kira asked who was paying for those appointments. Dr. Bishop stopped writing, and for the first time, she glanced toward the far end of the room. You ask him about that, she said. I only take care of the baby's heartbeat. When Kira sat up and wiped the gel from her stomach, Romano had already released the back of the chair. He stood straight again, and everything that had passed across his face during those 3 minutes had disappeared completely, leaving no trace behind. He said, the car is waiting in the basement. Kira took the ultrasound picture, folded it in half, slipped it into her coat pocket, and realized her hand was trembling, not because of the image on the paper, but because she had understood that from the moment he called her his wife in front of an entire hospital lobby, this was no longer something she could decide by herself. The car was waiting in the basement, and the driver opened the rear door for her without asking where she wanted to go. Kira sat down, holding her bag tightly on her lap. Romano got in from the other side, closed the door, and the car pulled away from St. Agnes Hospital. He said nothing for the first 4 minutes. Then he said, the baby will carry my last name. Kira turned toward him. That's the only thing I won't negotiate, he continued. Everything else is your choice. Where you live, which doctor you see, where you give birth, who you want near you and who you don't. I won't interfere. You choose everything except one thing, disappearing again. Kira listened until he finished before answering. You told those people I was your wife. Yes, he said. You said it before asking me a single question. That's also true. Then I want to hear the reason, she said. Not the reason you gave that hospital director. The real reason. Romano looked straight ahead. There were about 30 strangers in that lobby this morning, he said. Out of those 30 people, I didn't know who any of them were. Before I opened my mouth, you were an uninsured pregnant woman waiting for a number ticket. After I opened my mouth, you became something people could use to bargain with me. I created that, and I can't take it back. Then maybe you should have kept quiet, Kira said. Maybe, he said. But I didn't, and now I have to deal with the consequences of that. He turned toward her for the first time since getting into the car. In the world I live in, a promise is only worth the person who makes it. People can test how far my promise goes. Paperwork is different. A legal wife isn't something I declare. It's something recorded in the county books. It means that if someone touches you, they're not touching someone I know. They're touching my family, and that comes with its own laws, mine and theirs. You understand what I'm offering you, don't you? I understand, Kira said. You're asking me to sign a piece of paper so you can have peace of mind. I'm asking you to sign a piece of paper so you'll stay alive, he said, still in that same even voice. Kira looked down at her hands. She thought about the lobby, about 30 faces turning to look at her, about the way a charge nurse had rushed over to ask whether she was bleeding after she had stood beside that column for nearly 3 hours. Let me out at the next intersection, she said. Romano didn't repeat his offer. He didn't ask why. He simply tapped 2 fingers against the back of the front seat, and the car pulled to the curb. Before she opened the door, he said, I'm not forcing you, but I won't pretend this morning didn't happen. Kira got out. She walked 2 blocks before taking the train back to Logan Square. and the whole way there she kept reaching into her coat pocket to make sure the folded ultrasound picture was still there. By the time she got home, it was past 11 in the morning. She had a warehouse shift at 2 in the afternoon and a bar shift at 7 that evening, which meant she had about 2 hours to eat and sleep. Several envelopes lay on the floor just beneath the gap under the door. She picked them up and opened them right there. The first was a debt notice, month 14, $41,000. The borrower's name printed clearly as Kira Whitmore, the balance unchanged. She read the number one more time, then placed it on the table with the others. She put a pot of water on the stove. She took off her coat, hung it on the hook behind the door, and pulled the ultrasound picture from her pocket, smoothing it flat on the kitchen table to remove the crease. Then she went still. Beside her picture, about the width of a hand away, was another sheet of paper. The same thermal paper. The same gray and white frame. The same printed line in the upper left corner, the hospital's name, the date, and the numbers marking a gestational age of 16 weeks. Kira picked it up. It wasn't hers, because hers was lying right there, still warm from her hand. This was the second print, the one Dr. Bishop had fed out and discarded because the image had printed crooked at one corner. The very one Kira had watched someone toss into the paper waste bin on the 7th floor less than 3 hours earlier. She turned and looked at the door. The deadbolt was still locked. The lock was intact, without a single mark from being forced, and the frame wasn't scratched. The window was closed, and the latch was still in the exact position she had left it at 5 o'clock that morning. The water on the stove began to boil, and Kira stood there, one hand holding her own picture, the other holding someone else's, and understood that someone had stood exactly where she was standing now, inside this apartment, and placed it there for her to see. She didn't know who it was, but she knew one thing. Whoever had done it had been at the hospital that morning, and had been there before Romano ever walked through those doors. Kira turned off the stove. She sat at the table with the 2 sheets of paper in front of her, and remained there for nearly an hour, then took out a pen and a piece of paper, and began to write. She wrote 4 lines, crossed them out twice, then copied them over neatly. It was after 1 in the afternoon when she finally dialed the number he had left her. He answered on the second ring. She said she wanted to see him, and he asked where she was, and 40 minutes later the car was parked outside. She didn't get in. She stood on the sidewalk in front of her building and handed him the paper. Romano read it. She had written that she would keep working, both jobs, until the doctor told her she had to stop. She had written that she would go back to nursing school with her own money, and he wasn't allowed to pay for it, wasn't allowed to call anyone, wasn't allowed to arrange a place for her anywhere. She had written that she wouldn't spend his money. And on the final line, she had written that if his world ever touched the baby, even once, he had to let her and the child leave, and he wasn't allowed to come looking for them. He read the entire page, then started again from the beginning. He didn't argue with a single line. He folded the paper into quarters, unbuttoned his coat, and slipped it into the inside breast pocket. "I keep my word," he said. That afternoon, they went to the Cook County Clerk's office. They were asked for identification, their names, their dates of birth, whether she had ever been married, whether he had ever been married. Both said no. They paid a $60 fee. The clerk behind the counter stamped the documents, signed them, slid the marriage license through the opening in the glass, and said something she had probably said dozens of times that day, that under Illinois law they had to wait 1 full day, that the earliest the ceremony could take place was the following morning, and that the license was valid for 60 days. Romano thanked her. When they reached the door, he asked whether she wanted him to have someone drive her home. Kira said no. That night she worked the bar shift until 2 in the morning, and when she got back to the apartment, she sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the light. The marriage license lay on the table. She knew perfectly well that it was only a piece of paper, that nothing bound her yet, that tomorrow morning she could simply not show up, not answer the phone, not open the door, and in 60 days it would expire as though it had never existed. She also knew that the second ultrasound print was still lying beside hers, and whoever had placed it there hadn't needed any license at all to enter this apartment. She slept for about 3 hours. At 8:30 the next morning, Kira was at the Richard J. Daly Center. She wore the cleanest sweater she owned. Romano arrived a few minutes before her and stood in the hallway on the 4th floor, accompanied by 2 men he introduced simply as witnesses. One of them was named Dario Conti. The ceremony took place in a small room, with 3 rows of chairs and a flag standing in the corner. The officiant read the required language, asked whether she consented, asked whether he consented, then told them to sign in 3 places. There were no rings. No one took pictures. There were no flowers. From the moment they walked in until the moment they walked out. 11 minutes passed, and another couple was already waiting in the hallway. When they reached the lobby, Kira looked down at the copy of the marriage certificate in her hand and thought that she had imagined this moment many times when she was a little girl, but never once had it looked anything like this. Early that afternoon, Romano said there was somewhere they needed to go. The car headed west, out of the city, toward a quiet neighborhood in Oak Park lined with 2-story houses and broad porches. He stopped in front of a red brick house and said, "My mother." Kira asked whether she already knew. He said, "She knows everything." The woman who opened the door was 67 years old, her back straight, a kitchen towel still in one hand. She looked at her son once, then looked at Kira for longer. She didn't invite them any farther than the living room. The 3 of them stood there, and she listened to everything. She listened about the bar, about Kira leaving at 5 o'clock in the morning, about the 16-week pregnancy, about the marriage certificate signed 4 hours earlier. She didn't interrupt once. When Romano finished, she turned to Kira and asked exactly one question, whether the list of conditions she had written for him had been written before or after she learned how much money this family had. Kira said, "Before." Gianna nodded. Then she said, "I don't judge people by the first time I meet them. I judge them by the second." She said nothing else. She took 1 step back and closed the door, slowly, not hard, without a single unnecessary sound. And Kira stood on the front steps of her husband's family home, still holding the marriage certificate in her hand, unable to tell whether she had just been accepted or rejected. 3 weeks passed, and nothing happened, which was exactly what made it hard for Kira to sleep. She still worked both shifts. She still stayed in the Logan Square apartment, though now there was always a car parked at the end of the block whenever she left home at midnight. On Tuesday morning, in her 19th week of pregnancy, she went to St. Agnes Hospital for her regular appointment, and she still entered through the main doors as she always had. She had barely pushed the glass door halfway open when 4 people stood up. No one told anyone else to do it. The woman at the information desk rose first, then the 2 nurses standing beside the blood pressure machine, then a security guard who had been leaning against the wall in the right corner. The woman at the information desk came around from behind the desk instead of staying there, and she called her Mrs. Ferraro. Kira was about to say that her records still listed her as Whitmore, but the woman had already turned and pressed the button on her radio. No one handed her a number ticket. No one asked whether she had identification. 2 minutes later, the elevator doors opened, and Thomas Kessler stepped out, his tie perfectly straight, both hands held out in front of him from about 16 feet away. He said, "Mrs. Ferraro," and told her that he had instructed the entire floor to call him the moment she arrived. He asked whether walking around had been tiring for her. He asked what the weather was like outside. He walked beside her toward the elevator, half a step behind, and when the doors opened, he held one hand against the edge until she was completely inside. 3 other people were already standing in the elevator. Kessler looked at them, and one of them said he could take the other elevator, then stepped out. The other 2 followed him. The doors closed, leaving only the 2 of them inside, and Kessler smiled and said the elevators tended to be crowded at this hour. When they reached the 7th floor, he didn't take her to the waiting chairs. He led her straight down the hallway, past 6 or 7 people sitting with files on their laps, and into a small room with a window that she had never seen anyone use before. There was bottled water already waiting on the table. 2 bottles, one of them already opened. He said Dr. Bishop would be there in a few minutes, told her to make herself comfortable, and then he didn't leave. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. He said he had been following her case and that he was deeply sorry there were things in the system that hadn't worked the way they should, and that he was having the entire process reviewed. Kira said thank you. Then he changed the subject. He said the hospital was creating a new position in the maternity department, something called a training coordinator, a person who would work between nursing and admissions, help patients understand hospital procedures, and report back to senior management about places where the system still caused problems. He said the position needed someone who understood patients from the patient's side. He said he couldn't think of anyone more suitable than her. Kira asked what qualifications the position required. Kessler waved one hand. He said this was a position being created directly by the hospital administration, so the administration had the authority to decide what qualifications were necessary, and in her case, he was prepared to classify her practical experience as equivalent. He said the salary out loud, and the number was 3 times the combined income from both of her jobs, not counting holiday pay. He said the group health insurance would take effect immediately on the first day, with no waiting period, and he emphasized the word immediately. He said the hours were flexible. She could come in whenever she wanted, leave whenever she needed, as long as she let them know. He said she should think about it, that she didn't have to answer today, didn't even have to answer this week. Kira sat quietly. She knew she should have felt relieved. $41,000 was still sitting on her kitchen table, and the number he had just spoken would pay that debt off in less than 2 years. She had spent 8 straight hours on her feet in the warehouse the night before, with a 19-week pregnancy, but she sat there feeling something else, something lodged just beneath her breastbone, neither happiness nor fear. It felt like the sensation of a stranger standing too close to you on the train, while smiling far too brightly. She asked whether the position had been publicly posted. Kessler said not yet, and said positions like this usually didn't need to be posted. She asked whether anyone else had been offered it. He smiled and said he didn't waste time inviting a second person when he already knew who the first one was. She said she would think about it. He stood up immediately, nodded 3 times, said that was more than enough, and when he reached the door, he turned back and told her that if she needed anything at all, she could text him directly, because he had left his cell phone number at the information desk on the first floor. The door closed. Kira sat alone in the room with the window and the 2 bottles of water, and she didn't touch either one. She thought about the way those 4 people downstairs had all stood up at the same time. She thought about the 6 or 7 people sitting outside in the hallway with files on their laps, people she had just walked past without having to stop for even a second. She still didn't have a name for what she was feeling. It would take another 4 days, and someone losing her job, before Kira finally found one. 4 days later, Kira returned to the hospital to collect the results of her blood tests, and she noticed the moment she crossed the lobby that there was someone new at the admissions desk. The chair behind the glass was now occupied by a young woman, probably not yet 25, fumbling with the ticket printer. Kira didn't ask anyone about it, but on the 7th floor, while she was waiting, 2 nurses standing a few yards away were talking in the kind of voices people used when they knew they weren't supposed to be speaking loudly. One said it had happened in a single afternoon. No meeting, no warning, just one call from upstairs. The other said she had worked there for 6 years. The first one said, "Well, that's how it is," and then both of them fell silent when they saw Kira look up. No one said a word to her about it. No one needed to. The entire floor knew who had been standing in that lobby 3 weeks earlier, and who had walked in behind her, and no one wanted to be the person who said the connection out loud in front of her. Kira collected her results, listened as Dr. Bishop talked to her about her iron levels, nodded, thanked her, then took the elevator downstairs. She walked out toward the east parking lot because Dario's car always waited there. The air was cold, and it was nearly 4 in the afternoon. She had gone about 20 paces when someone rose from a concrete bench near the exit, and Kira recognized her immediately. Rebecca Lang, 41 years old, no longer wearing a uniform, no name badge, a canvas bag held against her body. Kira had no idea how long she had been waiting there. Rebecca didn't come too close. She stopped about 10 feet away and said her name. Miss Whitmore. She used the name in the hospital records, not the other one. Kira stopped. Rebecca said she hadn't come to argue. She said she knew what she had done that morning, and she wasn't going to explain herself, because no explanation would change anything anyway. She said the words quickly, as though she had practiced them beforehand, as though she were afraid she would be interrupted if she spoke too slowly. Then she stopped, and the next part came much more slowly. She said she wasn't asking for her job back. She said she was asking for only one thing, that if Kira happened to speak to her husband, would she please say one sentence for her? Just one sentence, that this didn't need to go any farther. Kira asked, "Farther how?" Rebecca looked down. She said, "My husband." Then she couldn't continue. She opened her mouth, but all that came out was, "My husband needs that insurance. Please just say one thing for me." Kira stood there and looked directly into her face. She looked for a long time, longer than politeness allowed. She looked at the mouth that had told her the free appointments were gone for the day, at the eyes that had glanced down once before pushing her paperwork back without reading a single line. She thought about the 3 hours she had spent standing beside that column. She thought about the woman who had walked in 3 minutes after her and walked away holding a number ticket. And Kira said nothing. She didn't say she could. She didn't say she couldn't. She didn't say it wasn't her concern. She didn't say a single word. She simply turned and continued toward the car. Rebecca didn't call after her. During the 15 seconds it took to walk from there to the car door, Kira felt something rise inside her chest, warm and fast, and it felt exactly like the relief of finally setting a heavy burden down on the ground. She had stood there, and the other woman had been forced to wait. She had remained silent, and the other woman had been forced to listen to that silence. 15 seconds. Dario opened the door for her. Kira got in. The door closed, and in the quiet of the back seat, that feeling began to cool very quickly, faster than she could hold on to it. The car pulled out of the parking lot, and through the window she saw Rebecca still standing in the same place, not moving, still holding the canvas bag, her face turned toward the departing car. Kira looked away. She thought she deserved it. She thought the sentence again, clearly, in words inside her head, as though she were trying to stamp the moment with it. But the sentence didn't last as long as she wanted it to, because immediately behind it came another one, uninvited. What exactly had Rebecca been fired for? Not for mistreating a patient, because she had done exactly that to plenty of other people over 6 years, and no one had ever called down from upstairs before. She had been fired because this time the person pushed out of line had happened to carry a certain last name. Kira lifted a hand to her stomach and stared out the window all the way back to Logan Square without saying a single word to Dario. She still didn't know what illness Rebecca's husband had. She would find out on Friday afternoon, and when she did, she would understand exactly how much the one thing Rebecca had asked of her, that single sentence, was worth. On Friday afternoon, Kira went up to the 7th floor earlier than her appointment and asked the nurse she had overheard talking the other day directly. She asked what had happened to Rebecca Lang. The nurse looked around once before answering. Her husband has dialysis on the 3rd floor 3 times a week, she said. He's been doing it for more than 2 years, and he's on the transplant waiting list. Their insurance is through her group plan. Once she loses the job, the coverage ends at the close of the month. There's a program that lets employees keep buying the same insurance after leaving a job, but then they have to pay the entire premium themselves. And the family plan here runs about $1,400 a month. Kira asked why Rebecca had been fired. The nurse was quiet for a moment, then said, "Are you really asking? Or are you just asking because you feel like you should?" Kira said, "I'm really asking." The other woman said, "What happened at that desk happens almost every week, and no one has ever been punished for it before." Then she said nothing else and walked toward the medication room. Kira remained on the row of waiting chairs with the test results in her hand, and the name she had been searching for over the past 4 days finally came to her. Kessler hadn't fired Rebecca because she had treated a patient badly. He had fired her so he would have something to carry upstairs to the man who had stood in the lobby that morning. Something that proved he had handled it, reviewed it, done something. Rebecca hadn't lost her job because of justice. She had lost it because she was the cheapest gift he could wrap up and send away. And the name that gave that gift its value was the name Kira now carried. On Saturday morning, she took the train and then a bus to Oak Park. She didn't call Romano. She didn't tell Dario. She stood on the front steps of the red brick house and rang the bell. And when Gianna opened the door, she didn't ask why Kira had come. This time, she opened the door wider and told her to come into the kitchen. She poured her a glass of water and sat down across from her. Kira told her everything. She told her about the 4 people who had stood up in the lobby, about the room with the 2 bottles of water and the job title no one had ever posted, about the 2 nurses talking in the hallway. She told her about the parking lot, about the 10 feet between them, about the plea to say just 1 sentence. And she told her that she had stood there looking directly into that woman's face, then walked away without saying anything. And for the next 15 seconds, it had felt good. She used the word good. She didn't search for another word to replace it. Gianna listened to all of it without interrupting once. When Kira stopped, she didn't comfort her, and she didn't scold her. She only said, "At least this time you realized it yourself before someone had to point a finger in your face." Then she stood, took a small framed photograph from a drawer in the sideboard, and placed it on the table with the picture facing Kira. In it was a very young girl with dark hair, smiling as she stood beside a bicycle. Gianna said her name was Marisa, Romano's younger sister. She died 16 years ago, when she was 19. Kira set down her glass of water. Gianna continued in an ordinary voice, neither rising nor falling. She said that on that night, Marisa had been brought to the emergency room, and they were told there was a problem with the girl's insurance records, that they needed to verify them again, needed to call the company, needed to wait. She said she had sat in that lobby for more than 5 hours. She said, "During those 5 hours, people came in after us and were taken in before us, and I counted it happening 4 times. She didn't say anything else about that night. She only said, by the time they finally agreed to take her in, it was already too late." Kira asked softly, "How old was he then?" 22, Gianna said. His father was still alive, still had control of everything, and Romano was nothing back then. He stood in that lobby for 5 hours, and there wasn't a thing he could do. He begged, "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" He stood there and begged them. She turned the picture frame back toward herself before continuing, and this was the moment Kira felt a chill travel down her spine. Gianna said, "Do you know why he was at that hospital that morning?" Kira said she didn't. Gianna said, "For 16 years, once every year, he goes there on that exact day. He doesn't tell anyone. He doesn't go into any department. He just walks through that lobby and leaves. This family has been giving money to that emergency department for 15 years, and he has never allowed his name to appear on a single plaque. That Tuesday morning was the anniversary of her death." Kira sat in silence for a long time. She thought about the 4 steps he had taken inside the lobby, and the way he had stopped. She thought about the question he had asked, and about how he hadn't looked at the woman behind the glass even once. Gianna said, "Romano wasn't angry because you were treated with disrespect. He was angry because he had stood in that exact lobby once before, and that time he had no power in his hands." She put the picture frame back into the drawer and closed it. Then she said, "Now he does. And you just saw what he used that power to do." Kira opened her mouth to say she would fix it, but Gianna had already stood and gone to wash the glass, and the back she turned toward her said more clearly than any answer could have that a promise meant nothing now. The easiest solution was right there in her coat pocket. All Kira had to do was dial 1 number, say 1 sentence, and before dinner, Rebecca Lang would have her job back, maybe even with a raise. She sat on the bus back into the city thinking about that for 40 minutes, and then she decided that if she did it that way, the admissions desk would keep operating exactly as it always had, except this time it would be bending in the opposite direction because of her. On Monday morning, she got up at 5 o'clock and started with the only thing she had, an understanding of how a hospital worked from the bottom up. She called the main switchboard, asked to be connected to human resources, and asked exactly one question: what the internal grievance process was for challenging a termination decision and who had the authority to receive such a complaint. They gave her the name of an office and the floor number. She wrote it down. Then she began the part that took the most time. She collected everything, 1 piece at a time. Copies of 6 years of timesheets required 2 trips because the first time she was told she wasn't an employee and therefore wasn't entitled to them, but by the second time she knew to say that she was filing a formal grievance and had the right to request documents relevant to the case file. She obtained the admissions department staffing schedules from a longtime shift supervisor after sitting with him for 15 minutes and explaining why she needed them. Then she asked Human Resources directly how many disciplinary reports Rebecca Lang had received in those 6 years, how many written warnings, how many formal patient complaints. The answer was none, not a single one. There were 2 annual evaluations rating her as exceeding expectations, and 1 letter of commendation from the internal medicine department. Kira typed everything up on a computer at the public library, printed it, clipped it into a packet, and nowhere in that packet did she write a single word about herself. She didn't mention Tuesday morning. She didn't mention who she was or what last name she carried. She wrote only that the termination decision had been made within a single afternoon, without any prior written warning, without a meeting with the employee, without any document specifying the misconduct, and that this violated the hospital's own 4-step procedure printed in its employee handbook. At 9 o'clock Tuesday morning, she was at the Human Resources office on the 5th floor and submitted the packet. The person at the desk said it would be forwarded for review and could take several weeks. Kira said she would wait. The woman asked whether she meant wait there. Kira said yes. She sat down on the row of chairs outside the 5th floor office and remained there for 4 hours. Around noon, someone came out and told her the department head was in a meeting. She said she knew, and she stayed seated. At 1 o'clock, a man came out from inside carrying the packet and asked what relationship she had to Mrs. Lang. Kira said none at all. He asked why, then, she was doing this. She said because the decision violated procedure, and the hospital would have to explain itself if someone asked the right questions. At 2 o'clock, they invited her inside. The meeting lasted 18 minutes, and no name other than Rebecca Lang was mentioned. Kira went through the packet page by page, pointing to each place that mattered, speaking in the calm, even voice of someone who had prepared so thoroughly that she had no need to raise it. When she left the room, she didn't know the outcome. 9 days later, Rebecca Lang returned to work. They reassigned her to the medical records department on the second floor rather than the admissions desk. But it was still a full-time contract, still with group health insurance, and the time she had been away was reclassified as a paid suspension with back pay. Kira learned about it from the same nurse who had spoken to her before, who told her in an astonished voice that she couldn't understand why the people upstairs had suddenly changed their minds. Rebecca never learned who had spent 4 hours sitting in the 5th-floor hallway. The two women would pass each other many more times in that hospital, and Rebecca would never know. That same afternoon, after submitting the packet, Kira went to the 9th floor and asked to see Thomas Kessler. He saw her immediately, wearing the same smile as before, and he assumed she had come to accept the job. He had already begun telling her that he planned to place her office in the East Wing because it was quieter there. Kira said she wasn't taking the position. His smile stopped halfway across his face. He asked whether the salary wasn't right, and said that could absolutely be renegotiated. Kira said it wasn't about the salary. He asked what it was about. Then, she said, 3 weeks ago my records weren't enough to get me a clinic ticket. The name Ferraro doesn't make me any more qualified today. Kessler opened his mouth, then closed it again. Kira continued, when you publicly post a position and I have the qualifications you require, I'll apply like everyone else. Then she thanked him and walked out. No one was waiting outside the door. No one applauded. She took the stairs down all 9 floors because she wanted the time alone, and that evening she still went to her warehouse shift at 7 o'clock just as she did every week. She didn't tell Romano what she had done. She wouldn't tell him for many months. Romano gave her only 3 rules, and he gave them all at once in the car without a long explanation. First, no fixed routines, which meant never taking the same route 2 days in a row, never going to the same coffee shop at the same hour, never letting anyone predict where she would be on a Thursday morning. Second, no pictures, nothing posted online, no letting anyone photograph her, even at a party. Third, never go anywhere alone, at any hour, for any reason. Kira broke all 3 rules within 9 days. She took the same train at 10 o'clock at night 3 evenings in a row, because it was the only one that got her to the warehouse shift on time. She let an old friend take a picture with her at the bar, and didn't remember the second rule until the photograph was already online, after which she had to send a message asking for it to be deleted. And she went alone to Oak Park that Saturday without telling anyone. Romano knew about all 3. He didn't shout. He said only one thing to her about it, that she could break his rules as many times as she wanted, but the person who paid the price for it wouldn't be her. Kira asked who it would be. Then, he didn't answer. At the end of the 2nd week, he told her there was a dinner and that she should be there. He said it wasn't an invitation. The dinner took place in a private room on the 2nd floor of a restaurant on the north side of the city, with 8 men and Kira. No one was introduced by title. Romano gave only their names, and she noticed that every one of them spoke to him in the tone people used with the man sitting at the head of the table, not merely the man paying the bill. They were so polite to her that it became uncomfortable. The man beside her poured her water before she could reach for the pitcher. The man across from her asked whether she could eat this dish, asked how many weeks pregnant she was, asked whether the doctor had said everything looked all right, but not one person asked what she did for a living, and Kira understood that all of them already knew. They had known before they entered the room, and together they were avoiding that subject the way people avoided a puddle in the street. For 2 hours, she was being weighed and measured. She could feel it not through the questions, but through the silences, through the way someone paused half a beat before laughing, through the fact that every time she finished a sentence, 2 or 3 people glanced toward the head of the table to see whether Romano reacted. The man seated to Romano's right was about 34 years old, spoke less than the others, and smiled more than the others. Romano introduced him as Vincent, his cousin. During the first half of dinner, Vincent asked her several harmless questions: where she had grown up, how cold Chicago felt this time of year. Near the end of the meal, when the conversation had softened and coffee was being poured, Vincent set down his cup and spoke in the friendliest voice anyone had used all evening. He said, "I'm asking seriously, so don't be offended." The entire table went quiet for 1 beat. Then he continued, "Did you marry him before or after you found out how much this family has?" Then he smiled and added, I'm only asking because a few people sitting here are wondering the same thing but don't have the nerve to say it, so I'm asking for them." No one laughed with him. The man pouring coffee stopped moving. Kira set down her water glass. She didn't blush, and she didn't look toward Romano because she knew that was exactly what Vincent was waiting for. She looked straight at Vincent and said, "You're asking the wrong question. The right question is, when did I find out how much this family has?" And the answer is, I still don't know. I haven't asked, and I don't intend to. She continued, "What I do know is that there are $41,000 in debt at the bank with my name on it, and I'm paying that myself. If you want to know why I married him, ask me directly. Don't ask on anyone else's behalf." The dining room went completely silent. Not the polite silence from earlier, but something different, the kind where no one dared be the first person to make a sound. Vincent still had a smile on his face, but one corner of it had shifted slightly. He opened his mouth as though he meant to say something to soften the moment. But before he could speak, he glanced toward the head of the table by instinct, just as everyone else had been doing for the past 2 hours. And Romano didn't defend her. He didn't say a single word. He didn't strike the table, didn't laugh, didn't change his posture. He simply set down his coffee cup and looked at Vincent, and he held that gaze far longer than normal, long enough for everyone at the table to realize that he was watching him, and then long enough again after that. Vincent was the one who looked away first. He reached for the water pitcher, poured himself a glass, and said the coffee here was actually pretty good. 2 men immediately agreed with him, a little louder than necessary. Dinner ended 15 minutes later. When they reached the car, Kira asked Romano why he hadn't said anything. He said, "Because you didn't need me to." She asked, "What about Vincent?" Romano looked out the window for a while before answering, and what he said wasn't an answer to her question. He said, "Did you notice that everyone at the table looked at me before answering you? Only one person looked at me afterward." Kira didn't understand what that meant. She would understand 3 weeks later. Kira enrolled in classes again during her 22nd week of pregnancy. She didn't apply to the full program because she still couldn't afford it, but there was an evening refresher course 3 nights a week, with tuition paid month by month, and she paid the first month with money from her warehouse shifts. Classes ran from 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock at night in an old building near the train station. She didn't tell Romano she had enrolled. She told him she was busy on those evenings, and he didn't ask what she was busy doing. On Wednesday night of the 3rd week, rain began falling in the middle of the afternoon and never stopped. Class ran late because the instructor hadn't finished the section on circulation. It was 10:20 before Kira reached the lobby, and she stopped at the glass doors because she hadn't brought an umbrella, trying to calculate how long it would take to run to the train station. Then she saw the car. It was parked across the street against the curb with its lights off. She recognized the license plate. She stood watching it for about half a minute before stepping out into the rain and crossing the street. The rear door opened before she could knock. Romano was sitting inside alone. No Dario, no one else, and there was no music playing. Kira got in, her hair wet, and asked how long he had been there. He said 7 o'clock. She looked at the clock on the dashboard. 3 hours and 20 minutes. She asked why he hadn't come inside. He said, "Because you didn't invite me." She asked why he hadn't called. He said, "Because you would have told me to go home." Kira sat quietly. Rainwater ran down the collar of her shirt. She asked how long he had known she was taking classes. He said since the 1st week. She asked who had told him. He said no one, and that she had left the tuition receipt in the pocket of the coat hanging by the door. Then he added, "I didn't pay it for you. I read the paper you wrote." Kira turned to look at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring through the windshield, where the wipers moved back and forth in a steady rhythm. He said, "I'm not good at this." She asked, "At what?" He said, "Sitting in a car for 3 hours without knowing what I'm doing here." She didn't answer. She thought about saying something to make it lighter, but she couldn't find a single sentence that didn't feel wrong. Then she did something she hadn't planned. She took his right hand, the hand resting on his thigh, and placed it against her stomach. Romano didn't pull away. He didn't say anything either. He simply sat still, his hand resting there, his eyes still fixed on the windshield, while the only sounds inside the car were the wipers and the rain striking the roof. About half a minute later, the baby kicked. Not hard, only a small movement beneath the center of his palm. Kira saw his shoulder move slightly, only slightly. He said nothing. Neither did she. They sat that way for a long while. Then Romano drew his hand back, shifted the car into gear, and drove her home to Logan Square. Neither of them spoke the entire way. And when the car stopped in front of her building, he only said, "On Friday, I'll have someone pick you up after class." Kira said okay. It was the first time she didn't argue with one of his rules. 4 days later, Dario Conti called Romano just before 1 o'clock in the morning. He had spent nearly 2 months working on this. The building in Logan Square had 3 cameras, 2 in the lobby and 1 at the rear emergency exit, and the recordings were kept for only 30 days, so the earliest footage had already been erased. But the emergency exit had an electronic lock, and the lock kept a record every time it opened, even when it was opened with a maintenance access card from building management. Dario traced the card. It had been issued to a cleaning company under contract with the building, and that company had hired a temporary worker who stayed exactly 11 days before leaving, during the exact period when the second ultrasound print appeared on Kira's kitchen table. Dario found the worker's name. Then he found the person who had paid him. Dario said over the phone that he had checked 3 times and wanted to tell Romano in person, rather than over the phone. Romano told him to say it now. Dario was silent for 1 beat, then said, "He isn't one of Rizzo's people. The man was paid through an intermediary account, and for the past 2 years that account has received transfers from only one source, Vincent's." Romano said nothing. Dario continued, "And there's one more thing. That man started taking money in February." Romano asked, "What day in February?" Dario read the date aloud. The other end of the line remained silent for a very long time. That date was 3 weeks before the morning at St. Agnes Hospital. Romano did nothing to Vincent during the next 3 weeks. He changed only 2 things. From then on, Dario drove Kira himself, and her medical appointments were no longer entered into any system, except a small notebook kept in Dario's coat pocket. Kira wasn't told why. In her 25th week of pregnancy, on Thursday afternoon, they left the clinic at 4:10 and headed north on the Kennedy Expressway. Traffic was moderate at that hour. Kira sat in the back seat holding the results from her glucose test, halfway through reading them when she noticed Dario glance at the rearview mirror for the 3rd time in less than a minute. He didn't say anything. He simply moved into the right lane, then back into the left, and Kira looked up. A dark-colored car was traveling alongside them on the left, maintaining exactly the same distance through both lane changes. Then Dario spoke 3 sentences very quickly. "Put the paper down. Lie flat on the seat. Don't sit up no matter what you hear." Kira lay sideways across the back seat, with both arms wrapped around her stomach. The car accelerated. She heard the engine change pitch, the tires screech as Dario cut across 2 lanes at once, then the long blast of a truck horn somewhere behind them. There was a light impact against the rear left side. Not hard, just enough to make the entire car shift before Dario pulled it straight again. He didn't brake. He pressed harder on the accelerator and moved into the far right lane beside an exit. Then at the last possible second, he swerved back and passed it. Kira heard a long screech on the right, the sound of the other car being forced onto the exit because it couldn't change direction in time. There was still one more car. It pulled close behind them. Then came 2 sharp, dry cracks, and the rear passenger window shattered. Glass fell across the back of Kira's coat. She didn't scream. She only tightened both arms around her stomach and pressed her face into the leather seat, and she could hear her own heartbeat pounding inside her ears. Dario accelerated again, then cut diagonally across 3 lanes onto the Ohio Street exit, and the other car was already too far to the left to follow. He drove another 4 blocks, turned twice, then stopped inside a parking lot with a barrier gate. He turned around and asked, "Are you hurt?" Kira said no, and her voice managed those 2 words before disappearing. Dario made 2 phone calls, each lasting less than 10 seconds. 7 minutes later, 2 more cars arrived. They took her to St. Agnes Hospital through the basement entrance. Dr. Bishop examined her for 40 minutes. Her blood pressure was higher than normal but not dangerous. The baby's heartbeat was steady. There were no contractions. Not a single shard of glass had cut her skin. The doctor told her she was completely fine, and she said it 3 times because Kira didn't hear her the first time. Because throughout those 40 minutes, Kira trembled. She didn't cry. She lay on the bed while both legs shook from the knees down and wouldn't stop, and every time she tried to hold them still, the shaking moved into her hands. A nurse placed another blanket over her. Kira said thank you, and she could hear her teeth striking together as she spoke. Romano arrived at 6:15. He entered the room, closed the door behind him, and didn't ask the doctor a single question first. He walked straight to the bed and sat in the chair beside it. He looked at her trembling hands. Then he reached for the glass of water on the table to give it to her, and the glass shook in his hand. Not much, just enough for the surface of the water to ripple and tap lightly against the side of the glass twice, making a very small sound. Kira saw it. Romano knew she had seen it. He put the glass back on the table without giving it to her and rested both hands on his knees. He sat there in silence for about half a minute. He didn't apologize. He didn't say, "I'll kill them." He didn't say a single word. Then Kira watched that moment pass through him. She couldn't have explained how it happened, but she saw it clearly, like watching a door close from the inside. His shoulders lowered. His breathing became even again. When he looked up, there was nothing left on his face. He asked her, "Did you hear them say anything?" Kira said no. He asked, "Do you remember how long the first car stayed on the left before the second one appeared?" She thought about it, then said, "About a minute." He nodded. He asked 3 more questions, all like that, short, precise, without a single unnecessary word. Then he stood up. He told her she was staying there that night, that the room had already been arranged, and that someone would bring her things tomorrow. His voice was so normal that Kira felt cold. At the door, he stopped and said one final thing to her. "What happened today wasn't aimed at you." Kira asked, "Then who was it aimed at?" Romano didn't answer. He opened the door, and Dario was already waiting in the hallway. Kira heard exactly one sentence Romano said to him before the door closed, and there wasn't a single word of command in it, not a single word of anger. He said, "Call Vincent. Tell him to come to dinner Saturday." Kira agreed to move out of Logan Square during her 27th week of pregnancy, and she agreed because Dario told her plainly that the building had 3 entrances, and he couldn't protect all 3 of them. She had only one condition, that she would pack her own things. On Tuesday morning, she sat in the middle of the floor with the cardboard box that held all of her mother's papers. She hadn't opened it since the day she moved into the apartment. Inside were Evelyn's medical records, a copy of her death certificate, the hospital financial responsibility form Kira had signed when she was 25, her signature still round and careful, and the stack of debt notices arranged by month. She flipped through them until she reached the most recent month, and stopped. The letter she had received that day, the one showing $41,000 and an unchanged balance, was the notice for month 14. But at the bottom of the box, there was another envelope, larger than the others, one she remembered stuffing in there without ever looking at carefully. She opened it. Inside was a notice of full payment. The entire balance had been paid in full. The date printed on the document was 3 months earlier. Beneath it was a line identifying the paying party, and it wasn't the name of any medical debt relief program. It was the name of a trust company, along with an identification number. Kira sat on the floor for a very long time. 3 months earlier was before that Tuesday morning at the hospital. Before even the night she learned she was pregnant. She had read somewhere that some funds bought up hospital debt and erased it in large batches. And when this notice arrived, she had believed she had somehow fallen into one of those rare chances. She had believed it for exactly 3 months. That evening, she put the document in front of Romano. She didn't ask a question first. She simply laid it on the table and waited. Romano looked at the paper, then at her, and he didn't pretend for even half a second. He said, "Yes, I paid it." Kira said, "I wrote on that paper that I wouldn't spend your money." He said, "You wrote that paper 3 months later." She said, "You know what I meant." Romano gave one nod, accepting the point without arguing. Then he said, "Sit down," and he told her. He said that after the night at the Blue Hour, he went back the following evening and was told she had quit. He said he had people looking for her from that day forward, and they kept looking for 4 months. He said the number calmly, as though reading a line from a ledger. Kira asked how they had searched. He said, "You didn't leave a last name. You didn't leave a number. All I had was a first name and a few things you told me." He said he remembered that she had told him her mother spent 11 days in a hospital, and that Kira had been the one who signed the financial responsibility form. He said he had people start there, searching medical debt records where the guarantor was a woman in Chicago during that period. "It took 7 weeks to find her name," Kira asked. "And once you found my name, then what?" Romano said, "Then I paid the debt." She asked why he hadn't come to find her immediately. He was silent for one beat before saying, "Because you left through the emergency stairwell." People only do that when they don't want to be found. Kira sat quietly. She asked, "What about the pregnancy?" Romano looked at her and said, "I didn't know." He said it again so there could be no misunderstanding. "I didn't know until I was standing in that room looking at the screen." Kira said, "That morning you called me your wife before you knew." He said, "Yes," she asked. "So if I hadn't been pregnant, would you still have said it?" Romano answered without a second of hesitation. He said, "I would have." Kira lifted a hand to her mouth, then lowered it again. She asked the final question, and her voice was much quieter now. She asked, "Why me?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his own hands for a while before speaking. He said that for many years, every time he walked into a place, the place changed. People stood straighter, spoke less, smiled at the right moments. He said he had become so used to it that he no longer noticed. Then he said, "For 3 nights in that bar, you poured me water, and you didn't change anything. You asked what I did, I avoided the question, and you didn't ask again. You told a stranger sitting at the end of the bar about your mother. You talked to me without needing to know who I was." He paused, then continued, "That hadn't happened to me in a very long time." Kira said, "So you paid $41,000? Romano looked directly at her and said, "I didn't pay that debt to buy you. I paid it because I knew that hospital lobby owed you something it was never going to repay." Kira didn't thank him. She couldn't say anything at all. She picked up the document, folded it along its old crease, then stood and walked to the window, remaining there with her back to him for a long time. Because what was moving through her mind wasn't gratitude. It was a new question, sharper than every question before it. If he had spent 4 months searching for her through his own private network, then during those 4 months, who else in this family had known she existed? Saturday's dinner was postponed twice before it was finally held at Vitali, in the large room at the back, with 11 people. Vincent arrived on time and took the same seat as before, to Romano's right. He talked more than he had at the previous dinner, asked Kira twice how the pregnancy was going, and complimented Dr. Bishop, even though no one had mentioned Dr. Bishop. Kira sat beside Romano and noticed that he ate very little. The server went around the table pouring water, and when he reached Kira, he stopped on her right, leaning slightly toward her, and she looked up. She saw that face less than 2 feet away. It took only 1 second. The man who had stood partly hidden beside the second column near the exit. The man who hadn't backed away like the security guard or shifted restlessly like the people in the waiting area. The man who had lowered his eyes, turned halfway toward the wall, and started using his phone as she stepped into the elevator. He filled her glass, said, "For you, ma'am," then moved on to the left. Kira lowered her hand beneath the table. She found Romano's hand and held it. And she said very softly, just loud enough for him to hear, "The man who just poured my water was at the hospital that morning." Romano didn't turn his head. His expression didn't change. He set his napkin down on the table, and that single movement was enough to make Dario rise from the nearby table. Over the next 90 seconds, the entire dining room emptied. No one asked why. No chair scraped backward in panic. The person nearest the door left first. The next 2 followed. Dario stayed close to Kira's left side, and another man walked behind her. Romano was the last person to leave the table. There wasn't a single gunshot. Not one voice rose above a normal speaking level. The server was still standing in the corner holding the water pitcher when the door closed, and he never made it as far as the parking lot. What followed took 4 days. The man admitted that he took jobs one at a time, didn't know the name of the person who hired him, and knew only a phone number and a place where he collected payment. Dario traced the payment point backward, and this time it didn't run through the cleaning company. He uncovered a chain of transactions, stretching back 7 months, the first payment dating to August of the previous year, all of them passing through 3 layers of intermediaries before ending at the same final destination. That destination was one of Salvatore Rizzo's men, and at the other end, the person sending information out, steadily, for 7 months, was Vincent Ferraro. There had been 19 transfers in all. There were Romano's travel schedules for the previous 3 months. There were diagrams of 2 warehouses on the south side of the city that only 4 members of the family knew about, and there was the address of the Logan Square apartment, sent out 19 days before that Tuesday morning. On Wednesday night, they met in a warehouse west of the harbor. There were only 4 people inside: Romano, Vincent, Dario, and 1 other man standing by the door. No one touched Vincent. No one raised his voice. Romano pulled out a chair, sat down, and placed 3 things on the metal table. The first was a thick bound packet of transaction records, with all 19 transfers marked by colored slips of paper. The second was Vincent's passport. The third was a piece of paper with a phone number written on it. Vincent looked at the packet first, then at the passport, and he began to talk. He said it was a misunderstanding, that he had only kept contact with the other side to know what was happening, that he had done it for the family. Romano let him finish. When Vincent stopped, Romano asked only one question. He asked, "What did you send that apartment address for?" Vincent didn't answer. Romano pushed the piece of paper with the phone number toward him. He said, "This number belongs to a federal prosecutor. Tomorrow morning you'll call it, and you'll go there with your lawyer, and every one of these documents will arrive 3 hours before you do." Vincent's head snapped up. He said Romano's name, then said this family had never done that, not once, that the old man never would have. Romano cut him off, and his voice remained even. He said, "That's right. If my father were here, you wouldn't leave this room." He stood, pushed the chair back into place, and delivered the rest while fastening his coat. He said, "I'm about to have a child. I don't want my child growing up in a house where people disappear in the night." Vincent sat silent for a long time. Then he asked, "What if I don't call?" Romano said, "Then your passport stays here, and the documents still go there tomorrow morning. The only difference is that you'll have nothing left to negotiate with." Romano had gone halfway to the door when Vincent called after him. He said, "You know you just opened a door this family can't close again, don't you? Once people start talking about one thing, they start talking about another. Then they'll come asking about you." Romano stopped. He didn't turn around. He said, "I know." The next morning, Vincent Ferraro was stripped of every position he held, removed from every list, and no one in the family took another call from him. The documents arrived at the prosecutor's office at 9:15, and 11 days later, for the first time in 16 years, an unmarked federal vehicle was parked across the street from Romano's office. In her 30th week of pregnancy, on Monday morning, Kira went in for a routine appointment and wasn't allowed to go home. Dr. Bishop checked her blood pressure 3 times in 20 minutes, ordered a urine test, then removed her gloves and sat down in the chair across from her. She said the condition was called preeclampsia, that it wasn't uncommon, that it could be managed, but that beginning today, Kira would have to remain in the hospital for observation. Kira asked how long. The doctor said at least 4 days. Kira asked the next question in a quieter voice. She asked, "What about the baby?" Dr. Bishop didn't avoid the question. She said, 30 weeks is early. If the baby is born now, the baby can survive, but there will be a fairly long stay in the neonatal intensive care unit. We'll try to keep the pregnancy going until 37 weeks. She said try, not definitely, and Kira heard the distance between those 2 words clearly. They moved her into a room on the 7th floor, connected her to a monitor, fastened 2 sensors across her stomach, and every 4 hours someone came in to check her blood pressure, even through the night. She called Romano at 11 o'clock that morning. The phone rang and went to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. She called a second time at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and the same thing happened. She didn't call a third time. She sent Dario exactly 1 line, saying she was in the hospital, everything was fine, and there was no need to rush. Then she placed her phone face down on the table and didn't touch it again until evening. The afternoon felt longer than Kira had expected. She lay there listening to the baby's heartbeat coming through the machine beside her, that fast, steady rhythm, and she thought that this was the second time in her life she had been alone in a hospital with no one sitting in the chair beside the bed, and the first time had been 14 months earlier, on another floor, when she hadn't been the one lying in the bed. She didn't cry. She only wrapped her hand around the metal rail along the side of the bed every time the machine changed its sound, holding on until her fingers went numb. At 7 o'clock that evening, a nurse came in to check her blood pressure again and asked whether she wanted to call anyone. Kira said no. She said thank you, then turned her face toward the wall. At that same moment, about 5.5 miles away, Romano was sitting through his 11th hour inside a windowless room on the 9th floor of the federal building. He had arrived there at 8 o'clock that morning in response to a subpoena. His attorney sat to his left. Across from him was Special Agent Paul Hensley, 44 years old, assigned to organized crime, a man who had been following the Ferraro name for 6 years and had never once been this close to it. In those 11 hours, Romano answered exactly 7 questions. 6 answers were names and dates. The 7th was the sentence in which he said he wouldn't answer anything further. Hensley didn't get angry. He went out, came back in, went out again, came back again. Near 7 o'clock that evening, he stopped asking questions. He placed a thick file on the table and pushed it across. He said, "This isn't ours. This is yours. You sent it to the prosecutor's office last week." Romano didn't touch the file. Hensley continued, "You gave us your cousin. Do you understand what that means? It means you're the first person in that family in 20 years to do something like that, and now the whole city knows it." He tapped one finger against the cover of the file. He said, "Rizzo's people are looking for you. Your own people are counting how many of them are still going to stay. And I have all the time in the world." Romano still said nothing. Hensley leaned back in his chair and spoke the next sentence in an ordinary voice, almost a kind one. He said, "I know your wife has been at St. Agnes since this morning. 30 weeks. Romano looked up. It was the only time in 11 hours that he did. Hensley said, "I'm not telling you that to threaten you. I'm telling you so you understand what I know, and so you understand that other people know it too." Then he pushed the file a little farther toward Romano and said the last thing he would say that evening. "You can keep the throne, or you can keep them. There isn't a third door." Romano's attorney began saying something about ending the interview. Romano raised one hand and stopped him. He looked at the file on the table for about 10 seconds. Then he stood, put on his coat, and didn't give Hensley a single word in reply. At 8:40 that night, he was on the 7th floor of St. Agnes Hospital. Kira was asleep. Only a small light near the head of the bed was on. The machine was still running, and the rhythm on the screen remained steady. Romano didn't wake her. He pulled out the chair beside the bed and sat down, and he stayed there all night, both hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the green line moving across the monitor. When Kira woke shortly before 5 o'clock in the morning, he was still sitting there. She looked at him and knew immediately that something had happened during the night while she slept. Something he hadn't told her, and wouldn't tell her yet. Because for the first time since she had met him, this man looked like someone who had just finished making a very large decision. Romano called Hensley at 9 o'clock that morning from the 7th floor hallway, and he said only one sentence, that his attorney would be in touch that afternoon. 3 days later, inside a conference room in the federal building, he placed on the table the thing he had kept locked in a safe for 4 years. The Ferraro family didn't touch drugs. That had been his father's rule. And Romano had kept it through all 8 years of his own leadership, not out of conscience, but because the old man had always said drugs brought long prison sentences and brought the federal government with them, but precisely because Romano stayed out of it, he had been able to watch. For 4 years, his people had documented every shipment Salvatore Rizzo moved through 3 river ports and 2 warehouses on the south side of the city. They recorded the names of intermediaries, container numbers, the names of 2 pharmacies being used as fronts, and even the names of 2 customs officials receiving monthly payments. Fentanyl. The entire network, from the point of entry to the street-level distribution. Hensley opened the first file, read for about 4 minutes, then called 2 more people into the room. Romano had only one condition. He wanted witness protection made available to Kira and the baby, beginning on the day she gave birth, and he wanted it written clearly that the decision to enter the program or refuse it belonged to her, not to him. The price was read back to him from the other side of the table, 1 line at a time. He would plead guilty to 1 federal racketeering charge. He would surrender every asset whose legitimate source he couldn't explain. He couldn't leave the state of Illinois. He would remain under electronic monitoring until sentencing, and sentencing would be postponed until he had completed all of his testimony in the Rizzo trial, which could take a year, perhaps 2. No one promised him that he wouldn't go to prison. Hensley said that plainly. That part belonged to the judge, not to him. Romano signed. He didn't tell Kira. He returned to the hospital that afternoon, sat beside her bed for 2 hours, asked about her blood pressure reading that morning, and didn't say a single word about the room on the 9th floor. On the 4th day of her hospital stay, Kira was cleared to go home, with monitoring twice a week and strict instructions not to remain on her feet for too long. On her final morning before discharge, someone knocked on the door. Thomas Kessler stepped into the room holding a large envelope and said he would only take a moment. He placed the envelope on the edge of the bed. He said St. Agnes Hospital had a scholarship fund for prospective staff members, and that this year the fund had 1 full scholarship available for a nursing program, tuition, books, certification, examination fees, everything. He said the scholarship didn't require the normal selection process, that all it needed was his signature, and the partner school would admit her directly. He said he had already filled out the information section, and all she had to do was sign the final page. Kira opened the envelope. Inside was exactly what he had described. Full funding. 4 semesters. There was even a monthly living allowance. She read as far as the 3rd page, where the source of the funding was listed, and stopped there. She asked, "Who funded this scholarship?" Kessler said it came from the hospital's general fund. Kira asked again, "Where does the money in the general fund come from?" He hesitated for half a second, then said that this year the fund had received a large donation, and the donation had been made in the name of a company. Kira asked for the company's name. He said it aloud, and Kira recognized it immediately, because she had seen that same name printed on the line, identifying the paying party on the document, showing that her $41,000 debt had been paid in full. She closed the packet. She put it back into the envelope, smoothed the edge flat, and handed it back to Kessler. He didn't reach out to take it. He said she should bring it home and think about it. Kira said, "I don't need to think about it." He asked why, and he sounded genuinely confused. Kira said, "Because this scholarship isn't mine." He said this was an opportunity, that many people could only dream of getting something like this, that she was pregnant and about to have a baby and needed to be practical. Kira said, "I still want the next scholarship, but I want it for the right reason." Kessler picked up the envelope, stood there for another moment, then walked out. No one else was in the room. No one heard that conversation except the 2 of them. Kira didn't tell Romano about it, just as she hadn't told him about the 4 hours she had spent sitting in the 5th-floor hallway. 3 weeks later, when she had reached her 34th week of pregnancy, she sat at the kitchen table in the new house and filled out an application for the nursing program at Morton College in Cicero for the spring semester. She applied under the name on her original records, Kira Whitmore. She submitted no letters of recommendation. She drove herself to the college to take the entrance examinations in reading comprehension and mathematics, sitting among more than 30 other applicants, with her 34-week pregnant belly pressed close against the edge of the desk so she could fit. The essay asked her to explain why she had chosen nursing, with a limit of 500 words, and she wrote about 11 days in a hospital and a night shift nurse whose name she still didn't know. She didn't mention anyone's last name. The result arrived 19 days later. She opened the envelope beside the mailboxes in the lobby, read the first line, then read it again. Accepted. No one on that admissions committee knew whose wife she was, and that was exactly why she had to lean against the wall for a while before she could make herself go upstairs. In her 36th week of pregnancy, on Tuesday morning, Romano took Kira to her appointment. In the car, he told her he had arranged for the basement entrance to be opened, that an elevator would be waiting, and that she could go straight to the 7th floor without passing through anywhere else. He added that he now had an electronic monitor around his ankle, so he couldn't stay upstairs with her for long, but Dario would go with her. Kira listened to everything and then said, "Let me out at the main entrance." Romano turned to look at her. He didn't ask why. He simply watched her for about 2 seconds, then tapped 2 fingers against the back of the front seat, and Dario pulled over in front of the main entrance to St. Agnes Hospital. Kira got out of the car alone. She walked through the glass doors at 7:50. There were about 20 people in the lobby, mostly women, a few with their husbands beside them, and one person sitting on the floor with her back against the wall because there were no chairs left. Kira walked to the end of the line and took her place. There were 7 people ahead of her. No one stood up. No one recognized her. She stood there for 18 minutes with one hand supporting her lower back, and during those 18 minutes, she heard the woman in front of her ask the person beside her how many appointments were still available that morning, and the other woman said she didn't know, probably some. The line moved forward. When it was her turn, Kira stepped up to the glass window and placed her paperwork on the counter. The woman sitting behind the glass was Rebecca Lang. She had been transferred back to the admissions desk at the beginning of the month. The 2 women looked at each other. 3 seconds. Rebecca said nothing. She didn't apologize. She didn't have the expression of someone preparing to apologize either, because she didn't know where a sentence like that was supposed to begin, and they both understood it. She pulled the paperwork toward herself. She read it. She truly read it, from top to bottom, turned to the 2nd page, checked the dates, and typed into the computer. Then, she tore a ticket from the roll, wrote the room number by hand in the corner, and slid it through the opening beneath the glass. She said, "Number 42. Please have a seat and wait." Someone will call your name. Kira took the ticket. She said thank you. Then she turned and walked toward the waiting area, taking a seat in the 4th row, the second empty chair from the aisle, between a woman tapping on her phone and a man holding a folder on his lap. She placed the ticket on her thighs. She looked at the number printed on it, 42. Behind her, about 16 feet away, Dario stood leaning against a column and didn't come any closer. 7 minutes later, someone sat down in the empty chair to Kira's left. Kira turned. Gianna Ferraro placed her handbag on her lap, straightened the edge of her coat, and sat upright facing the clinic doors. She didn't explain how she knew Kira was there. She didn't ask how long Kira had been waiting. She didn't say anything at all. Kira didn't ask either. The two women sat beside each other that way. The speaker called number 37, then number 38. A young woman stood, walked past them, and the clinic door closed behind her. Gianna took a packet of peppermint candies from her bag, unwrapped one, and offered it to Kira. Kira took it. Gianna unwrapped one for herself. Then she put the packet back in her bag and sat quietly again. The speaker called number 39. Outside the glass doors, the car was still parked at the curb, and Kira knew Romano was still sitting inside it. Not coming upstairs, not calling, just like that rainy night outside her class. Number 40. A man passed by pushing a wheelchair, its wheels squeaking across the floor. Number 41. The woman sitting to Kira's right stood, slipped her phone into her bag, and left. The chair beside Kira was empty now. 20 minutes had passed, and Gianna still hadn't said a single word. Then the speaker called. Number 42. Kira placed both hands on the arms of the chair to push herself up, and she found it harder than she had expected at 36 weeks. Gianna stood first. She held out her hand, and Kira took her arm to pull herself upright. The two women stood side by side, and Gianna didn't let go of her. She said, "This is the second time." Those were the exact words she used, nothing more, no explanation. Then she began walking, drawing Kira with her toward the clinic door, and over those dozen or so steps, she continued in an ordinary voice, as though speaking about the weather. She said, "Walk slowly, sweetheart." Kira stopped for half a beat. Gianna didn't stop, didn't turn to look at her, didn't repeat herself. She simply kept walking, still holding Kira's arm. Kira felt her eyes grow hot, and she blinked twice very quickly before continuing. The clinic door opened. Inside, a nurse holding a clipboard looked up and read the name, Kira Whitmore. Kira said, "Yes, that's me," and she walked inside, while Gianna sat down in the chair outside the door to wait, just like everyone else who was waiting for someone they loved that morning. In her 37th week of pregnancy, Kira went into labor shortly before 4 o'clock on Friday morning. By 7:15, she was in a delivery room on the 7th floor of St. Agnes Hospital, and Dr. Claire Bishop arrived at 7:30. At that same time, in the basement of the east parking garage, two men walked in through the vehicle ramp without passing through any security checkpoint. They wore maintenance uniforms and carried a toolbox. They headed straight toward the north elevator bank, the only set of elevators that went directly to the 7th floor, without stopping in the lobby. Dario Conti had been waiting there since 5 o'clock that morning. He didn't draw anything. He simply stepped out from where he had been standing out of sight, blocked the elevator doors, and told them the elevator was under maintenance. The two men stopped. One glanced toward the emergency exit on the left, where two people were already standing in windbreakers, one of them holding up a badge. The other man turned toward the ramp they had just entered through, only to find that a car had somehow been positioned across it. On the 7th floor, Dr. Bishop was telling Kira to breathe out very slowly now, and count. 1, 2, 3. And Kira heard her voice more clearly than anything else in the room. There were no gunshots in the basement. There was the sound of the toolbox falling onto the concrete floor, the sound of someone reading them their right to remain silent, and the sound of handcuffs locking shut, twice. The entire thing took less than 4 minutes, and no one on the floors above knew what had just happened beneath their feet. Dr. Bishop counted to 3 again. Then a new sound filled the delivery room, small, hoarse, broken at first, then growing louder, and Kira began to cry before she even saw the baby. 9:42 in the morning. 7 pounds, 1 ounce. Healthy. That afternoon, Salvatore Rizzo was arrested at a restaurant in Bridgeport while eating lunch, along with 4 other men, based on the very files Romano had placed on the table inside the federal building. Romano arrived at the hospital 40 minutes late, because the monitor around his ankle allowed him to travel only during registered time windows and along approved routes, and he had been forced to wait while someone confirmed the trip by phone. He stepped into the room and stopped at the door. Kira looked at him and said, "Come here." They placed the baby in his arms, and Romano held his daughter the way a man holds a child when he has never held one in his life. Both arms stiff, his back straight, afraid to breathe too deeply. He said nothing for nearly a minute. Then he asked softly, "What are you going to name her?" Kira said, "Evie, after my mother." Then she looked at him and continued, "And I want her middle name to be Marisa." Romano looked up. He watched her for a long time. He didn't ask how she knew, and she didn't tell him. He only lowered his eyes to the baby and gave one small nod. Evie Marisa Ferraro. 1 year later, Romano was running a legitimate trucking company on the south side of the city. Its books opened to federal audit every quarter, 31 employees, and not a single contract he didn't sign under his real name. His sentencing still hadn't happened because the Rizzo trial was continuing, and he still had to testify. He still wasn't allowed to leave the state. He never complained about it to anyone. Kira was in her first year of the nursing program at Morton College, and during the spring semester she was assigned clinical training 3 days a week at St. Agnes Hospital itself. On her first morning, she wore a trainee badge that read K. Whitmore and entered through the main doors at 6:45. As she passed the admissions desk, she slowed. Behind the glass, Rebecca Lang was leaning toward the speaking window, explaining the assistance program to a young woman in an old coat, speaking slowly, repeating the part about the paperwork twice, pointing toward the sign that showed the hours when number tickets were issued. She didn't glance down at the woman's feet even once. Kira stood there for a few seconds. Rebecca looked up and saw her. The two women nodded to each other. Neither said anything, and neither needed to. On Saturday afternoon, on the porch of the red brick house in Oak Park, Gianna sat in a rocking chair holding her granddaughter, softly singing an Italian song whose name no one in the family could remember. Romano sat on the front steps, and in the inside breast pocket of his coat, he still carried the piece of paper Kira had written by hand on the sidewalk in Logan Square, folded into quarters, all 4 corners worn smooth, never once taken out. There are some things in this life that are very simple, yet we often forget them. A person's dignity doesn't live in the clothes they wear, in the insurance card they hand across a counter, or in the last name they carry. No one deserves to be pushed out of line simply because they look as though they aren't worth serving. Power, no matter how great, only truly has value when it is used to open doors for others rather than close them. And a person shouldn't be measured by the first time they stumble, but by what they choose to do the second time, when no one is standing there watching. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so we can continue listening together to more compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And has there ever been a time in your life when someone treated you as though you were invisible? Or have you ever given someone a second chance? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.